Good afternoon, everyone. We will be starting shortly. Just give us a minute or two to allow a few more people to log in. So bear with us for a minute or so. Thanks. Okay, let's start. Good afternoon. My name's Pam Bandel. I'm a member of the UK BIM Alliance and Engagement Co-Lead, and for this afternoon, your host for this webinar. As you can see here, this is all around the UK BIM framework, and those supporting the UK BIM framework include the UK BIM Alliance, Centre for Digital Built Britain, and the British Standards Institution, or better known as BSI. A reminder that the UK BIM framework sets out the approach for implementing BIM in the UK for managing information provided by the ISO 19650 series. It includes published standards, it includes the guidance documents and links to other resources as well. This afternoon's event is part of the guidance webinars to support this content on the UK BIM framework. Before we get into the details, let me tell you how the GoToWebinar system works. On the platform itself, if you have a question, please ask your question via the questions tab. If you could avoid the raise hand option, that would be great, unless you're specifically asked to raise your hands. You are in listen only mode, and this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the YouTube channel next week, on the UK BIM Alliance YouTube channel next week. As mentioned, this is the final webinar in a series of guidance webinars that have taken place today and yesterday. Shortly, you'll hear from Marzia and David around Part D, Developing Information Requirements. But as you can see from this list, we've had 5 other webinars take place. And again, all of these will be available on the UK BIM Alliance YouTube channel next week. For now, before we hear from David and Marzia, let's listen to Sarah and David, who tell us a little bit more about the guidance framework and about the guidance documents.
Welcome to this webinar about the guidance supporting the BS-EN ISO 19650 series of standards. The UK BIM framework is supported by BSI, CDBB and the UK BIM Alliance.
I'm Sarah Davidson.
And I'm David Churcher.
And along with Anne Kemp, we're co-editors of the ISO 19650 guidance.
The guidance is supported by a group of dedicated individuals who give their time and expertise for free. These individuals might be authoring or providing feedback on the content.
And you can see that David, Anne and I work alongside them in the management, editing and publication of the guidance. We also work closely with CDBB, who lead on the presentation of the guidance. The ISO 19650 series currently comprises Part 1, 2, 3 and 5. Part 1 covers the overall concepts of information management using BIM. Part 2 is specific to the delivery phase, design and construction of assets, and Part 3 covers the operational phase. Part 5 sets the requirements for the adoption of a security-minded approach to information management as a whole.
ISO 19650 Part 4 is currently under development, and it's due to be released hopefully in early 2022. The guidance was first published in April 2019 in the form of concepts guidance. Part 2 guidance followed in July and has been subject to update and expansion every quarter since then. We welcome and encourage feedback from the whole community, as this is fundamental to shaping the direction of the guidance. So if you have feedback on the guidance, please do email us on guidancefeedback@ukbimframework.org.
The fourth edition of ISO 19650 Part 2 guidance was 160 plus pages long, and this was clearly becoming unwieldy, and some of the key feedback from industry was that we needed to make the guidance more accessible. So in July of this year, we developed a new guidance structure that you can see here. We now have Part 1 guidance setting out the concept of the ISO 19650 series overall. Part 2 guidance considers the specific requirements of ISO 19650 Part 2, and Part 3 guidance, which has only recently been released, is starting to explain the requirements of ISO 19650 Part 3.
In addition, we have guidance parts A to F, which are intended to cut across the whole of the ISO 19650 series, and they cover key themes where detailed guidance is considered necessary. Guidance for Part 5 will be developed by the Centre for the Protection of National Infrastructure, CPNI, in due course.
So Guidance A covers the information management function and resources. It considers the activities that need to be carried out and offers a resource map supporting the information management framework.
Guidance B covers open data and building smart topics. It will also cover COBE, but this section is not yet written.
And Guidance C covers the common data environment in terms of workflow and technology. It looks at assignment of metadata as required by the National Annex to ISO 19650 Part 2 as well.
Guidance D is all about information requirements. It explains the fundamentals of what they're trying to do and the details of different types of requirements with some very detailed examples.
Guidance E currently covers the BIM execution plan in supporting tendering and appointment activities. It will be extended in due course with content to cover more tendering and appointment resources.
And finally, Guidance F covers information delivery planning. This includes the responsibility matrices and the task and master information delivery plans. It also has space for guidance on the federation strategy, but again, this is not written yet.
We hope this provides you with a little insight into the development of the guidance, and we'll hand you over to the more detailed guidance discussion just now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah and David. Let me introduce or hand over to David Churcher and to Marzia Bolpagni to talk about Guidance Part D. David, over to you. David, you're on mute.
Sorry, that took a little minute to come off mute. I apologise. Can you see my screen? And when I
We can see your screen, yeah. If you click into presentation mode.
Can you see the whole screen in presentation mode?
Not yet, no.
Oops, hang on, sorry. Oh, come on. I thought this was too good. It went perfectly in rehearsal.
No. There we go, it's working.
Oh, thank you, sorry, technology. Thank you, Pam. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on the Part D guidance. I'm going to say a few words about information requirements, and then Marzia is going to follow up with level of information need. So my name's David Churcher. I'm the director at Hitherwood Consulting, and I've been the author of two parts of the ISO 19650 series, parts 1 and 3. And as was mentioned in the introduction, I'm one of the co-editors of the UK BIM Framework guidance. I'm also a UK BIM Alliance ambassador. So the first part of this webinar is going to be me saying a few words about information requirements, what they do and what they're for, and then Marzia is going to explain about the level of information need. So let's start by thinking about information and what it's for. And it's really important in the framework for 19650 that to recognize that information is for a purpose. It has to be produced for a reason. And by that, in that way, it has value, and it justifies the time and cost that is taken to produce the information. Historically, we've thought mostly around just the delivery of information, the lower half of the diagram on the slide, from the provider back to the information receiver. We haven't really, before BIM and now the ISO series, thought so much about the ultimate purpose of the information and therefore how the information requirements need to be set out. And this is a key part of the 19650 standards to make sure that the requirements for information are clearly expressed and conveyed in the degree of detail that's necessary to get that correct amount of information back from the information provider. Most of us will probably be familiar with the fact that information requirements come in various types, as indicated on this slide, and that those types of information requirements are organized into a hierarchy, ranging from those at very high level and strategic level, down to the detailed information requirements that are necessary to be included in a contract or other appointment documentation. So at the highest level of all, we have the organizational requirements, which really are conveying strategic information that's needed to run the business or the organization that is either owning and operating the asset or as the client for the project. Beneath those, we then have two sets of high-level information requirements, either at an asset-wide level during the operation and maintenance phase of the asset lifecycle, or for the delivery of a successful project through established governance procedures. And then at the most detailed level, we have the exchange information requirements, either operational requirements or delivery requirements, depending upon whether they've come from the asset or the project branch of the life cycle. But those are the requirements that are then conveyed to the appointed parties, the contractors, consultants, who are then responsible for producing and supplying the information. What all of this means is that there are many different information receivers and that they speak many different languages technically. Some of them will be capable of expressing their needs in very specific construction and asset management technical language, whereas others may not be able to do that. They won't have those skills. So a degree of translation and restatement of information requirements is necessary as they cascade down this hierarchy to the point where they can actually be included in a contract at the EIR level. But what this does is provides the opportunity for a clear line of sight back up the tree. So every single exchange information requirement should be able to be traced back to an asset or a project information requirement, and ultimately potentially back to an organizational information requirement. The different types of information requirement are also summarized in this table here. But for this slide, I wanted to focus just on the the columns in the middle of the screen, which are giving examples of the timing elements and the recipients of information, or those who might be creating information requirements, just to give you some ideas of the breadth of times and people who would be involved in identifying what these requirements are. So just to take a few examples from this slide, organizational information requirements, being at that sort of strategic level, are likely to be perhaps feeding into board meetings or into strategic reviews, or perhaps adding detail into statutory returns. The kinds of organizational departments that might be creating these organizational information requirements range very widely. So some examples could be information requirements coming from the finance department, from the compliance team, maybe from the corporate sustainability team, or possibly even the production teams. So very wide range of stakeholders engaged, and indeed some of the stakeholders might be outside of the organization and providing information requirements, such as external regulators. In terms of asset and project information requirements, then the timing of these the information that these generate is more likely to be tied into operational processes. For example, in asset terms, producing annual reports on the performance or the utilization of assets, or carrying out strategic reviews of asset performance. And in terms of project information requirements, then the timing may be related to the decision points that are used to progress the project from one governance gateway to the next. And in terms of who is receiving information and therefore setting out those requirements, then that might be asset managers and directors and project sponsors and managers. When we get down to the exchange information requirements, we're now dealing with the contractual obligations that are at an appointment level, either at a project appointment or at an asset appointment. And so here that the timing of exchange information requirements is going to be to support the decision points that have been included in the asset and project requirements. In terms of the examples of information requirements, then there are some detailed examples in the Part D guidance. But for the purposes of this webinar, I've simplified these into two examples which are shown on the screen. So the orange text shows an example of an organizational information requirement, perhaps based on a corporate policy whereby they want to support local workforces operating around their sites. And in terms of a project information requirement, that can then be translated into a target to have 80% of the project subcontract value allocated to firms who are within, in this case, a 30-mile radius of each site. So in order to determine whether that target is being achieved or not, then an EIR, an exchange information requirement, is created and handed across to the contractor of the project to provide some subcontract location reports at various milestones during the project. And from the data that's delivered according to that information requirement, then the client project manager can work out whether the project information requirement target is actually being met or not. In terms of the other example that we have, this is in the green text, showing an example perhaps to a corporate objective to reduce embodied and operational carbon by 40% by a 2030 deadline. And in terms of how that then gets translated down the chain, we can see that this becomes, or this feeds into, both an asset information requirement to produce an annual asset operation report on CO2 emissions, but then also a specific requirement to take CO2 reduction into account whenever equipment is being replaced during the asset life cycle. At the project level, then the same organizational requirement translates into the need for an embodied CO2 analysis, which shows how new projects are reducing embodied CO2 as they come to fruition. And again, in both cases, those requirements are then translated into more detailed information requirements, which are then available to be handed across to the relevant lead appointed parties as consultants or contractors working during the asset life cycle or during project delivery. So these are simplified examples, as I said, and more complex examples and probably maybe more realistic examples are given in the guidance D in the appendix at the end of that document. So just to say a little bit more about exchange information requirements, then from that previous example, I hope you can get the idea or understand that EIRs need to be made as specific and as focused as possible. And in the dark blue box at the top of the screen, then we have the suggested contents of exchange information requirements as laid out by the ISO standards. So we need to describe the information requirement itself. We need to describe the level of information need, which is going to explain the amount of content that is expected in the information. We then have ability to describe what the acceptance criteria are and whether there is any supporting information from the appointing party, the client or the asset owner, that's going to help the lead appointed party and their delivery teams to generate the information. And finally, we have a timeline, the dates when the requirement is needed. So that is quite a focused group of details that need to be conveyed in the EIR. And in effect, what we often see is EIRs being expressed as in a tabular form, in spreadsheets or perhaps in databases, but actually very succinct and precise in the content that they're conveying. And the reason that they can be so focused is because a lot of the background material that explains the rules and the constraints about generating information, or the background and context to why the information is needed, all of those details are then dealt with elsewhere. And the light blue boxes in the bottom half of the screen show the sort of supporting information and documentation that the client, the asset owner, or i.e. the appointing party, is making available alongside that tabulated set of information requirements. So that's another important aspect that that ISO 19650 deals with. Of course, in the context of today's topic, all of those supporting a lot of those supporting details are covered elsewhere, have been covered elsewhere in the webinar series, and indeed in the guidance suite as well. In terms of the information that is actually being produced and being specified in the exchange information requirements, then it's also important to appreciate that this can be in a number of different forms, and it is up to the appointing party, the client or asset owner, to be clear in their own minds exactly what information they are interested in receiving and what type of information that's likely to be. So information can generally be broken down into either structured or unstructured content. Structured information is is information that can be queried and can be asked questions, perhaps through computer systems or algorithms or computer analysis, whereas unstructured information is much more likely to need human interpretation to extract the meaning from that in unstructured content. And so some examples have been given in the circles, where geometrical and alphanumerical information are normally thought of as structured, 3D models with embedded data, or spreadsheets, or data streams from sensors would fit into those categories. Whereas documentation is generally thought of as unstructured and needing to be interpreted by humans, and that might be pictures or images, scanned documents, or even text-based reports. And that's the detail that needs to be completed or returned in those different information types can then be described in more detail using the level of information need framework that Marzia is going to be saying more about in a few moments. The final thing I wanted to just mention in this short session is to say a little bit more about the timing of information deliverables and information exchanges. So that is a key element of the exchange information requirements. And this diagram is taken from the guidance document and just illustrates that how all of this fits together. So when I was starting to talk about the purposes of information, I was talking about the key decision points that the appointing party needs to be engaging in. So that might be, for example, making a decision to award or to set a budget for construction for a new project based on design information. So if the decision has to be made at a particular point in time, then the information delivery milestone to collect the information that leads up to that decision has to be received a certain amount of time ahead, as shown on this slide, by X weeks. That is one of the information delivery milestones that the appointing party will be identifying as part of their supporting information in their information management process. And then once that information delivery milestone is known, then the more precise exchange dates for the deliverables coming from the lead appointed parties can be identified, again, potentially with a bit ahead of that milestone date, in order to allow for the review and checking procedures and potentially any corrections that need to be made to the information deliverables, so that the information can still be collated and passed across to the appointing party in time for that key decision point. And in terms of project decision points, then of course those are often related to the ends of project stages. So the example of agreeing a budget for the construction phase of a project may be a decision point that is towards or at the end of stage 3 if you're in a design and build type procurement, or possibly a particular point through stage 4 if you're in a more traditional procurement. So that's how timing is important and how that gets conveyed through the exchange information requirements. So in this short series of slides, I hope I've just been able to explain some of the key features of information requirements and show how some of this is explained through the guidance in part D. Just by way of summary then, it's important for us to remember that the development of information requirements is a key activity for the project client or the asset owner. It's where they need to be setting down and explaining the information that they need, that they're going to have be using in the future, and that they will be finding valuable to help achieve their those purposes and objectives. The information requirements themselves need to be in sufficient detail so that not only do the information providers have a clear understanding of what is expected, but also the end recipient has enough detail to be able to judge whether the deliverables are acceptable or not. And finally, because exchange information requirements are provided on at an appointment level, so many different sets of information requirements being handed over to different lead appointed parties in a project or during an asset life cycle, then it's really important that the appointing party, the client or asset owner, make sure that there aren't any duplications or gaps in that family of exchange information requirements documents. Because if there were, then there's clearly going to be wasted effort if multiple organizations are producing the same information, or indeed if there's a gap, then no information is going to be produced at all, and then the appointing party is going to have a hole in their information model that they cannot get decent information to help them make a decision. So thank you for that. If you've got any questions, then we'll address those at the end of the webinar. But now I'd like to move over to pass across to Marzia to talk us through level of information need.
Thank you, David. Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Marzia Bolpagni. I'm Senior Business Advisor at Mace, and also lead author on the standard on the level of information need, EN 17412 Part 1 on concept and principles, and I'm co-author or Part D on the guidelines and ambassador of the UK BIM Alliance. So I think that in the next slide, you can see why the level of information need framework is important. So in the ISO 19650 Part 1, the level of information need is defined, and is made clear that this concept has been introduced in order to avoid the waste of information, so overproduction or underproduction of information. And we want to provide the right information at the right time to the right actor of the process. And also it's really important to promote an automatic check of deliverables so that we are able to check that what we receive is compliant with our requirements. So in the next slide, there is the definition of the level of information need. So it's important for all of you that is a framework to define the quality, the quantity, and the granularity of information requirements. So it's important that you remind that it is a framework, and also that is advised not to use acronyms in order to define the level of information need. So what is new? In the next slide, we can see that we need to avoid using simple labels such as LOD 1, 2, 3 and a level of information 1, 2, 3 and so on. But we need to define first the prerequisite, and in particular to define the purpose, and then to specify the level of information need. So in the next slide, there are some references. So of course, you need to reference to the suite of document of the ISO 19650 in the different parts. These guidance that has been quoted with Emma Hooper. And then there is the standard that I mentioned before that is specific for the level of information need. This is a European standard that has been adopted also in the UK in November. It is available to everyone. And in addition, this morning in the next slide, you can see that also the information protocol also refer to the level of information need as being presented in detail this morning. So in the next slide, we start to specify one important concept. So information is required to fulfill a purpose. So this should be clear to everyone. And different purposes might require different information deliverables. So for this reason, different purposes might require a different level of information need. So here there is an example. If we need to do cost analysis, or if we need to do thermal design or embodied carbon calculation as being presented before, we need a different information. So it can be alphanumerical, geometrical, and documentation. So it's not just to define something really generic, but we need to be more specific and first of all define why we need the information. So in the next slide, we can see who needs to define the level of information needs. So everyone who is defining the information requirement should define the level of information need. So of course, at the beginning of the process, the appointing party, so for example, the client or the asset owner, they should define their level of information need. And probably you're thinking about your clients that don't have the skills in order to define in detail which is the level of information need. So as has been discussed also before, it's important that at least they define the purpose. So why they need the information. Do they want to do embodied carbon, for example, because it's part of the organizational information requirements? So that should be defined at least. And then there are two options. They can ask an independent third-party consultant to define the level of information need for them, or they can delegate it to the lead appointing party, of course, to pay attention not to create a conflict of interest there. And what is important also to mention is that the level of information need can be used also by the lead appointing party later on in order to define in more detail the granularity of the information the requirements in order to fulfill the purpose that initially the appointing party, so for example, the client, has been asking for. So for example, a designer, an architect might ask the geotechnical expert to define in more detail some specification in order to complete their appointments with the client. In the next slide, we can see when the level of information need should be defined. So every time that an information requirement is established, we need to specify the level of information need. And also is important that at a different point of time, we might have initially, as I said, that the client define the level of information need, and later on, where there are when the lead appointed parties should also define the level of information need and to cascade these with the delivery team. So in the next slide, we can see that what is new compared to the previous webinar that we did last time is that now in November has been published the European standard on the level of information need. And you can see here that it is made up of two parts, so the level of information need framework. First, there are the prerequisites, so why you need the information, the purpose that we mentioned before, the information delivery milestone that David has been introduced before, and then the actor, who is asking and who needs to provide the information, and the object within the breakdown structure. And it's important to remind that the object can be a different level of the breakdown structure. Probably at the beginning of your project, you define your information requirements at a higher level. So, for example, for the entire asset, for the bridge, for example, or for your building, and then moving forward in your project, and then you might have the need to define your level of information need, for example, a system level, if you're doing sort of MAP analysis, or at elements level, or maybe parts if you go in a further detail. And the level of information need framework is instead made of three main parts: the geometrical information, alphanumerical information, and documentation. That you can find those parts already defined in the ISO 19650 Part 1. But what is new in this standard, there are further elements that help user to specify the different aspects of the geometrical information. For example, here we have the detail, that is a continuum range from simplified to detail, the dimensionality, the location that can be absolute or relative, the appearance that also is a continuum range from symbolic to realistic, and the parametric behavior regarding the geometrical information. And then the alphanumerical, we have the identification within the breakdown structure, and then the information content, that is the list of the different properties, for example, that we need to deliver. And then the documentation, that is a set of documents that, as mentioned by David, is usually unstructured information. So in the next slide, you can see an example here for you. So the prerequisite, we don't have at the moment in the UK a predefined list of purposes, but you can find other information available in the industry or bespoke to your project. So why you need the information. For the when, as has been mentioned with the information delivery milestone, you can make reference to particular dates. And then the who, you can use, for example, Uniclass to identify the different actors. And then with the object, you can use different data schemas, for example, the FC1. In the next slide, you can see an example that is taken from the European standard on the level of information need. And you can see that, for example, for the preliminary design, you might need to have the visualization for communication. And then in this case, the architect should provide different objects, for example, the side, the wall, the window, and many others. And for each of those, there might be a requirement for the geometrical information, or maybe no. You just need the alphanumerical information. In this case, for example, for the site type, you might need the address, the geolocation, and so on in the survey drawings. And instead, for the walls, for visualization purpose, you are more interested on the graphical representation, so the geometrical information. In this case, you want the detail to be simplified as a volume, including the different openings, the dimensionality to be in 3D, so you want your representation to be in 3 dimension, the location absolute, because you want to have a geolocation, and the appearance to be realistic, because for visualization is really important to have also the texture of different materials. And the parametric behavior in this case for visualization purpose is not required because it's not relevant. And also you don't need alphanumerical information and documentation for this particular purpose, that is the visualization. So this is an example that you can find, and you can understand it's really specific in order to fulfill the purpose that you have been required by the appointing party, and actually you have been paying for. Because we need to remember that producing the information is time consuming, so there is a cost associated to that. So we want to make sure that what is produced is relevant for the different actors. So in the next slide, you have here a summary. So the level of information need is not the same on the level of definition. So I found some information requirements in BIM execution plan that now just change from the level of definition to level of information need. Is not like that. You need really to start defining, as is mentioned in point 2, which are the different prerequisites and in particular the purpose. And it's suggested not to use use an acronym for the level of information need. And remember that the level of information need framework include the geometrical, alphanumerical, and documentation. And the concept and principle has been included in BS-EN 17412 part 1. So this is the end of the first part regarding the level of information need. In the next slide, what David and I want to also to show you is an example of the exchange information requirement that has been initially created by Emma Hooper. So you can see in the next slide where you can find this information. So there are 2 references that we want to underline to you and put to your attention. So in the UK BIM Framework website under Standard and Guidelines, you can find in the additional resources one video that is really useful regarding information requirements and explain how the information requirements, the flow and the process and why they are important. So I really recommend this to have a look. And then the information requirements database example that we will show you now. So in the next slide, so this has been already presented in the previous video that you can find online by Emma. So this is just a reminder for everyone to have a look. So you can find in this, first of all, remember that is an example, so you don't have to paste and copy, but it just as a reference of the methodology. Is not complete, it is not meant to be finalized. And you can see that you can find the appointing party information requirements and also the lead appointing party information requirements. Usually in reality they are not in the same place, but it just, as I said, is an example to show how this can be created. And you can navigate, is an interactive tool and database, so please have a look. So in the next slide is we want to remember that also those information requirements has been defined for different appointments. So you can see how in order to fulfill different needs and different appointments, how those requirements can be filtered, for example, for the designer, the contractor, the manufacturer. And in the next slide, we want to give you a reminder that to please read how to use this database first. So there are practical indication. And you can find also how to specify the alphanumerical information, the geometrical information in the documentation using the level of information need framework in this particular example. So that is everything from us. So we welcome questions from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Marzia. Thank you, David. Very detailed presentation. We've had a fair few questions come through. So let me kick off. Okay, I'm just going to pick and choose them, and you guys can choose which ones you want to answer. Can information delivery milestone be interpreted as the deadline?
Into your mute, David.
Yeah. Sorry. That sounds like it might be for me. Yes, but I think it's important to remember that information delivery milestones are set by the appointing party. So they shouldn't be seen to be the deadline for the appointed parties to make their first submission, because there really could be some toing and froing with information deliverables being reviewed and checked and then maybe needing to be corrected. So yes, they are, if you like, the ultimate deadline as far as the supply chain is concerned, but they just need to be used as a guide for setting the internal deadlines within the delivery team, which would then be some weeks or in advance of the information delivery milestone, or whatever is appropriate.
Thank you. Does the EIR consist of a combination of parts of the AIR, OIR and PIR? Excuse me for the acronyms, but I can't remember what all the definitions are.
That's okay. Well, yes. Sorry, I'll maybe cop out and say yes and no, because it's unlikely that an EIR will be a direct copy and paste of something that has been expressed as an asset or a project information requirement, and certainly unlikely that it will be a copy and paste of an organizational information requirement, because those sets of information requirements are meant to be more broad ranging than just a single appointment with a single contractor or consultant, which is what the EIR is focused on. So as you saw from that example I gave in my slides, you can have a single asset information requirement that gives rise to maybe 4 or 5 or dozens of separate EIRs. Actually, they might be very similarly written, but they might be directed at different people, different suppliers. So if you've got to get similar information from across a wide group of people, like the where is your organization based, so I can do this location report, then effectively you're asking the same question to every single contractor that you've got on the team, but they'll all be in separate EIRs. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Okay, they really detailed some of these questions. So, does ISO 19650 reconcile information requirements relating to new, unknown, or innovative outcomes?
I'm not entirely sure I understand exactly what that's getting at. Marzia, I don't know, do you have any insights on this? I'm playing for time a bit here.
Yeah, I mean, it's not clear for the answer. Maybe with an example it will be useful. I think that when you read the ISO 19650 in the scope, you can find how this is applied to. So you can, find that, for example, is applying for appointments and, type of project that is both new and existing, type of works and during different phases. So it seems that maybe the question is more like, can you apply this for R&D project? Maybe is the question. I'm not sure. Maybe it can be if you apply this process also for research project that maybe you don't know. Then I don't know. I don't know if maybe you can provide a little bit of clarity regarding your question. We are happy to answer. But I think that the suggestion is that to read the scope of application of the ISO 19650, and then you can understand if it is applicable to your case.
Yes, agree. The other thing which occurred to me just as you were speaking there, Marzia, was that if you've got, for example, innovative technologies that are being incorporated into a project or into a scheme, then the need for information around those technologies is still there. It may be that because they are innovative, then that the client doesn't have the experience to ask exactly the right detailed questions immediately, or possibly the answers are not known because the technologies are too new. So the 19650 is still intended to apply in those cases, but the detail in the requirements themselves might then be less because of the innovation that they're concerning. I don't know, maybe that's where the question was going. But anyway, hope that's helped.
Brilliant. What advice would you have for information providers whose client/appointing party has not specified level of information need in any great deal at appointment stage, but subsequently wants you to commit your resources to help them develop them during the appointment? For example, a design consultant helping a client to develop level of information need for construction tender documents. What if you don't have this level of knowledge or experience, as this is a client need, not a design team lead?
That's for you, Marzia, I think.
Yeah, so that is for me. Yes, so I think that as mentioned in my presentation, we acknowledge the possibility that the client doesn't have the skills. So as mentioned, there might be the case where they ask the lead appointing party to help them to define those. And you, in your question, you say, okay, what happens if I'm asked to do that, but actually I don't know what the clients would like to do. So here I see mainly two options. So the first that is having a collaborative approach with them and to create workshop in order to understand if they have the organizational information requirements first. So as mentioned before, to understand what they want to achieve, and understand if you as a designer, you have the capabilities to help them to define those requirements. If not, you can ask also if you are the lead appointing party, you don't have those capabilities, you can contact a client advisor. So again, an independent third party that can help you and the client to define the requirements for the tender. And what is important is maybe the second option, as mentioned in the information protocol. So the level of information needs. So it's important when you have this relation with the client, and if you agreed to have an information protocol that is make clear that you don't take the responsibilities regarding the definition of the level of information because are outside maybe your scope of appointments, and you're maybe just providing an informal advice and so on. So what we suggest is really to have this collaboration and this dialogue. And if you really, as a designer, you feel that you don't have the capabilities to advise the client because it's not your job, then ask help to an independent third party that can help you to define the client's need on their behalf. Or as I say, you can then delegate further to the other actors within the appointments so that they can define the level of information needs and the need also to provide. But as mentioned before, we need to be careful on the conflict of interest also in this case. So I hope that I answer to the question.
Thank you, Marzia. We're almost at the end of the webinar. I'm going to ask one final question. What key risks and liabilities are raised by ISO 19650 information requirements for organisations?
Shall I start on that one? There are certainly risks and around the for the appointing party, so the project client or the asset owner and operator, because the thrust in 19650 is that those organizations have a clear understanding of what information they require and that they can express and describe that need clearly to their supply chains. So if those information requirements are actually not complete or they're missing certain elements, then the big risk is that information is not going to be delivered, or if the gap is spotted after the contract has been signed, then we have a variation when more costs are likely to be incurred, and possibly delays as well. So there's a risk to the client of not getting their specification correct, which is exactly the same risk as they have from their technical specification of a project. You know, if they change that after the contracts are signed, then of course variations occur and costs go up. The risks around the supply of information, I think, are about whether the providers can really understand the acceptance criteria and the tests that will be carried out by the client to make sure that the information is acceptable. And if they don't understand that correctly, then there could be a lot of backwards and forwards of further submissions, which is still going to waste time and effort while they're trying to get their submissions accepted. Marzia, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that you cover the main one. Yeah.
Thank you.
Brilliant. So thank you for the questions, and thank you, Marzia and David, for a fantastic presentation. As mentioned earlier, 6 webinars will be available on the UK BIM Alliance YouTube channel next week. You can see who was involved in presenting those webinars on this screen, and the best way of finding more information and getting in touch is through the website and email addresses that are shared up here. Thank you, Marzia. Thank you, David. And thank you, everyone, for attending. With that, I'm going to end the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.